My son was the kind of person who made strangers feel like old friends within 5 minutes of meeting him. I know every father says that about his child. But with my son, it was simply the truth. He had his mother's warmth, that quiet, generous way of paying attention to people that made them feel seen. After my wife Margaret passed away from a stroke, when our son was just 14, the two of us became a team. I worked double shifts at the lumber yard in Sudbury, then later managed the supply contracts for a construction company out of North Bay. My son did his part too. Never complained. Never asked for things we couldn't afford. Studied hard. And took care of the house while I was away during the week. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And in those years, that felt like enough. He grew up to be someone I was enormously proud of. He studied business at Laurentian University, worked summers at a real estate office in Barrie, and by the time he was 32, he had built his own property management company that handled residential and commercial buildings across southern Ontario. At its peak, the company managed over 400 units between Hamilton, Kitchener, and London. He had staff, accountants, a legal team. He had built something real from almost nothing, and he did it without ever losing the humility his mother had given him. His name was Thomas, and 2 years ago, I lost him to pancreatic cancer at the age of 41. I am 67 years old as I tell you this story, and in the past 18 months, I have fought the hardest battle of my life, not at the lumber yard, not in any boardroom, but in the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, against a man I once welcomed into my home. His name was Victor. He had been my son's business partner for 6 years before Thomas asked him to leave the company quietly. Thomas never told me all the details, only that there had been money taken from the operating accounts that Victor couldn't explain, and that he had allowed Victor to resign rather than pursue charges because he didn't want the scandal to affect his tenants and staff. Thomas was like that always, thinking about the people around him before himself. I told him at the time that his generosity would come back to haunt him. I never imagined how right I would be. When Thomas was diagnosed, he called me on a Tuesday evening in February. I remember standing in my kitchen in Sudbury, holding the phone against my ear, looking out at the snow covering the backyard, and feeling the floor disappear from under me. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. The oncologist at Sunnybrook had given him a treatment plan, but the words aggressive and moving quickly told me everything I needed to know between the lines. I drove down to Toronto the next morning and stayed for 6 weeks. Thomas kept working through the first round of chemotherapy, answering emails from the hospital bed, taking calls from his property managers, reviewing lease renewals. His business lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia, who had been with him for years, helped him begin putting his affairs in order early. Thomas was not naive about what the diagnosis might mean, even when he was still fighting hard to prove it wrong. Over those months, we had more honest conversations than we had ever had in our lives. He told me he wanted to make sure the company would continue helping people. He had several affordable housing agreements with the region of Waterloo that he was particularly proud of. He told me he had set aside a foundation with an initial endowment that would support those agreements in perpetuity. And he told me, quietly, one evening when his nurse had stepped out, and the room was just the two of us and the sound of the machines, that he was leaving me the remainder of his estate, $14 million. The property holdings, the investment accounts, the company shares that Patricia had helped structure into a proper trust. He had no spouse, no children. He had built it all, and he wanted it to go somewhere. It would be cared for. I told him I didn't need it. He told me that wasn't the point. Thomas passed away on a Thursday morning in late September. I was holding his hand. I will not describe what the weeks after felt like. Anyone who has lost a child understands that there are no words adequate to the weight of it, and I will not pretend otherwise. The call from Victor came 11 days after the funeral. I almost didn't recognize the number. It was a cell phone I didn't have saved. When I answered, his voice came through smooth and unhurried, like a man who had rehearsed the conversation several times before dialing. He told me he was sorry for my loss. He said Thomas had been like a brother to him. He said he had given the situation a great deal of thought and believed that given his 6 years of contribution to building the company, he had a legitimate claim to a portion of the estate. I asked him to repeat himself. He repeated himself. I told him Thomas had asked him to leave the company 3 years earlier. I told him Thomas had built the majority of the portfolio after Victor's departure. I told him there was no legal or moral basis for what he was suggesting, and I asked him not to contact me again. He said, very calmly, that he had documentation proving his contributions had been undervalued and that his departure had been coerced. He said he had already spoken to a lawyer. He said he hoped we could resolve things without going to court, for the sake of Thomas's memory. Then he hung up. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that call. Outside, the November wind was pushing dead leaves across the driveway. I thought about Thomas, about his decision 3 years ago, to let Victor walk away quietly rather than expose what he had done. I thought about how that kindness had now left a door open. I called Patricia the following morning. She had already heard from Victor's legal team. They had filed a notice of claim under the Succession Law Reform Act, arguing that Victor had an equitable interest in the company assets based on an alleged oral partnership agreement and unjust enrichment. It was, Patricia explained, a real legal mechanism, not frivolous on its face. Even if the underlying facts were fabricated, Victor had clearly been preparing this for a while. He knew the estate's value. He knew Thomas was gone. He had waited until the funeral was over to make his move. $14 million. That was what he was after. Patricia was direct with me. She said the claim would likely take 12 to 18 months to resolve. She said the evidence Thomas had left would be critical: the employment contracts, the departure agreement Victor had signed, the financial records from the period of the alleged partnership. She said we had a strong case. But Victor's lawyers were not amateurs, and we needed to be prepared. I told her to prepare. What I didn't tell Patricia yet, because I needed to confirm it myself first, was something Thomas had said to me during one of our last conversations in the hospital. He had mentioned, almost in passing, that before Victor left the company, Thomas had discovered something beyond the missing funds. He said Victor had used the company's registered address to conduct what appeared to be a side arrangement with a property developer in Mississauga, invoices routed through the company accounts, commissions paid to a numbered corporation that Victor controlled. Thomas had documented everything but had chosen not to act on it at the time. He had put the files on an encrypted drive. He had told me where it was. I went to Thomas's home office. His executor duties had passed to me, and I had the keys. The drive was exactly where he said it would be, taped inside the back of a filing cabinet drawer beneath old tax returns. I sat at his desk and went through every folder. Thomas had been meticulous. Spreadsheets cross-referencing invoices with property addresses, email threads he had printed and annotated, bank statements with highlighted transactions, a letter from the Mississauga developer sent to Thomas directly, asking why the commission arrangement had been terminated, which told me the developer had believed Thomas knew about it all along because Victor had apparently told the developer that Thomas was a silent partner in the side deal. Victor had not just taken money from my son's company. He had used my son's name without his knowledge to legitimize a scheme that, according to what I was reading, had processed nearly $340. 0 inches fraudulent commissions over 2 years. I called Patricia back that afternoon. There was a long silence on her end when I finished explaining. Then she said, Send me everything tonight. The legal process that followed was slow, in the way that Canadian courts are slow, not out of incompetence, but out of thoroughness. Examinations for discovery stretched across 3 sessions between January and April. Victor's lawyers were skilled at delay tactics, filing procedural motions that pushed dates back, requesting document productions that required weeks of response time. There were moments when I sat in Patricia's boardroom on King Street, watching the clock move through another afternoon of procedural arguments, and felt something close to despair. Victor, for his part, performed the role of a grieved business partner with considerable commitment. At the discoveries, he spoke about Thomas, with practiced sorrow, called him his closest friend, described their early years, building the business together as the best of his professional life, claimed the departure had been driven by personal misunderstandings rather than financial misconduct. He was polished. He had clearly been coached, but the documents didn't care about his performance. Patricia had engaged a forensic accountant from a firm in Waterloo, a quiet, precise man named Dr. Okafor, who had spent 20 years doing financial analysis for commercial litigation. He went through Victor's production documents, the company's historical accounts, and the materials from Thomas's encrypted drive with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed finding the truth in numbers. His report, when it came back in late March, was 73 pages long and left very little room for interpretation. The fraudulent commission scheme was laid out transaction by transaction. The numbered corporation tracing back to Victor was confirmed through corporate registry searches. The invoices were shown to correspond to no actual services rendered, and the email trail demonstrated conclusively that Thomas had not known about, consented to, or benefited from any part of the arrangement. Victor's claim of an equitable partnership interest was simultaneously dismantled. Dr. Okafor's analysis showed that the company's growth after Victor's departure had been driven entirely by new acquisitions and contracts that Thomas had secured independently, and that Victor's contributions during his tenure, while real, had been fully compensated through his salary and the severance he had accepted when he signed the departure agreement. Victor had signed that departure agreement. Patricia had found it. It contained a release clause that he had apparently forgotten about, or had assumed no one would find that, explicitly waived any future claims against the company or its assets in exchange for the severance payment. That piece of paper was what changed everything. The hearing before Justice Kellerman at Osgood Hall lasted 4 days. I sat in the gallery each morning and watched. Patricia and her co-counsel presented the case with a clarity that I found genuinely moving, not because it was dramatic, but because they had turned Thomas's careful, quiet documentation into something that could stand in open court and speak for him. Victor's lawyers attempted to argue that the departure agreement's release clause was unenforceable because it had been signed under duress. They called Victor to testify. He maintained his composure through the first day of cross-examination. But by the second afternoon, when Patricia began walking him through the forensic accounts findings transaction by transaction and asking him to explain each one, something in him began to unravel. He claimed not to remember. He said the numbered corporation had been set up for a different purpose. He contradicted himself 3 times across 2 hours. And Justice Kellerman noted each contradiction from the bench with the kind of measured, the quiet attention that told me she was keeping precise track. I thought about Thomas during those hours in the courtroom, about how he had let this man walk away to protect the people who worked for him, about how he had kept those files, carefully and completely, without ever telling me why. I think he knew, somewhere in the back of his mind, that documentation was a form of protection, even when you hoped you'd never need it. Justice Kellerman delivered her ruling 6 weeks after the hearing concluded. Victor's claim of equitable partnership interest was dismissed in its entirety. The departure agreement's release clause was upheld as valid and enforceable. Costs were awarded against Victor at the elevated scale, meaning he would be responsible for a substantial portion of the estate's legal fees. But the ruling went further than the civil claim. Justice Kellerman noted in her reasons that the evidence presented regarding the commission scheme raised serious concerns that fell outside the scope of the civil proceeding, and that she was referring the matter to the Ontario Provincial Police Financial Crimes Unit for further review. Patricia had anticipated this possibility and had already been in quiet contact with a detective from the unit for 2 months. Victor was charged 4 months later with fraud over $5. 0, 0, 0, and breach of trust. His trial date has been set for this coming winter. I will be there. The estate has been settled. The Affordable Housing Foundation Thomas created is operational. It funded 3 new subsidized units in the Waterloo region last spring, and the agreement with the regional government has been extended. Patricia helped me establish a small bursary in Thomas's name at Laurentian University for students in the business program who demonstrate financial need. It will fund 2 students per year. It is not a grand gesture. Thomas would not have wanted a grand gesture. I have been asked, since this became known in our community, how I kept going through all of it, the grief, the discovery, the 18 months of legal process, the days when the outcome felt uncertain. I think the honest answer is that I kept going because Thomas had kept going. He had sat in a hospital bed and made sure that everything was documented. Everything was structured. Every loose end was addressed, not out of bitterness, but out of love and responsibility. The least I could do was honor what he had left behind. There is something I want to say directly to anyone watching who is in the middle of a situation like this, who has lost someone and then discovered that someone else is circling what they left behind. Document everything. Find a lawyer who respects what is at stake. Be patient with a process that moves slowly, but, in this country, ultimately moves toward the truth. And do not let grief make you feel like you don't deserve to fight. The people we love built things. Those things matter. Protecting them is a form of love too. Victor thought he was dealing with an old man who was buried under grief and wouldn't have the strength to push back. He had watched my son show him mercy once and assumed the family was soft. He did not know Thomas very well, after all, and he knew me even less.